The morning I heard that chainsaw, I knew exactly what it was before I even opened my eyes, and that is the kind of sound that does not just wake you up, it crawls straight under your skin. By the time I got my boots on and ran across the kitchen, I already had this cold, sick feeling in my chest, because there was only one thing on my property my neighbor had been obsessed with for the past 6 months. And when I stepped onto the back porch and saw him standing there with sawdust on his jeans, smiling like he had just done me a favor, I realized some people do not cross a line because they are confused. They cross it because they believe the line should not exist for them. My name is Daniel Mercer, and back then I lived in a little hillside town called Briar Glen, tucked into the wet green edge of western North Carolina, the kind of place where the roads bend around old trees instead of cutting straight through them, where fog sits low in the morning and everything smells like cedar, rain, and chimney smoke. My wife Nora used to joke that our house looked like it had been dropped into the woods by accident, a small white farmhouse with a sloped backyard, stone steps, a sagging tool shed, and one enormous silver oak standing near the east fence, old enough that 3 adults holding hands probably still could not reach around the trunk. That tree was not just pretty. It was part of the reason the whole back slope stayed where it belonged. The soil out there was soft and layered, and when storms rolled in, water came down hard, sometimes for days. So the county had strict rules about old root systems and protected canopy trees. That oak had a bronze tag on it from the Briar Glen Heritage Canopy Program, which meant you did not cut it, poison it, hack at it, or sneeze too aggressively near it without permits, inspections, and about 12 people in clipboards judging your life choices. I loved that tree. Nora loved it too. In the summer, we would sit under it with cheap iced tea and listen to the cicadas scream like tiny broken machines. In the fall, the leaves turned this deep copper color, and the whole backyard looked like it had been set on fire in the softest way possible. To me, it was peaceful. To my neighbor, Russell Vance, it was apparently a personal attack. Russell moved in about a year after us, into the newer house on the other side of the fence, a big gray place with black shutters and one of those garages so spotless you could perform surgery in. At first, I thought he was just particular, the kind of guy who measured his lawn stripes and probably alphabetized his condiments. He was friendly enough in that stiff, neighborly way, always waving with 2 fingers from his driveway, always calling me buddy even though we were not buddy, always making comments that sounded like compliments until you thought about them for more than 5 seconds. He would say things like, "You've got quite a wild little setup over there, Daniel. Real natural." And I would smile because what do you even say to that? The first problem came when I found him in my backyard one Saturday morning pulling vines off the fence. Not his side of the fence, my side, nearly 20 feet into my property with pruning shears in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, like he had been invited. I asked him what he was doing, and he said, "Just helping keep the place from getting out of hand." I remember standing there in my sweatpants, trying to decide if I was more annoyed by the trespassing or by how casual he was about it. I told him, "Russell, I appreciate the thought, but you cannot just walk into my yard." He gave me this little laugh like I was being dramatic and said, "Come on, we are neighbors. Property lines are more of a guideline when the mess affects both sides." That sentence should have told me everything I needed to know, but I gave him the benefit of the doubt, because I was raised by people who believed you do not start a war over weeds. Over the next few months, though, Russell kept finding reasons to step over that line. He trimmed branches that hung nowhere near his house. He moved a stack of firewood because, according to him, it looked like a snake hotel. One time he left a printed article about invasive plants tucked under my back door, with sections highlighted in yellow, as if I had assigned him homework. Every time I told him the same thing, politely at first, then less politely. If something on my property bothers you, talk to me before touching it. He would nod, press his lips together and say, "Sure, absolutely, communication is key." Then 2 weeks later, I would catch him doing something else. Nora saw it before I did. She said, "He is not trying to help Dan. He is trying to manage us." I laughed it off then, but she was right. Russell had this need to control anything he could see from his windows. And unfortunately for all of us, his kitchen window looked straight toward our silver oak. The tree became his favorite subject sometime in early spring, right after he planted a row of imported roses along his side yard. They were expensive, fussy things, each one surrounded by little white stones, each one labeled with a copper marker, like a museum exhibit. I noticed him out there every evening, misting them, feeding them, inspecting them like tiny royal babies. Then one afternoon he came over while I was cleaning gutters and called up to me, "Hey Daniel, you ever think about taking that big oak down?" I looked over the edge of the ladder thinking I had misheard him. I said, "No, why would I do that?" He pointed toward his roses and said, "It is blocking my morning sun, and honestly, it is a little unfair." Unfair. That was the word he used, like the tree had woken up one day and chosen violence against his flower bed. I climbed down and explained that the oak was protected by county ordinance, that it stabilized the slope, that removing it was not only a bad idea, but also illegal without approval. Russell tilted his head and gave me this patient smile, the kind people use when they think they are talking to someone slow. He said, "Laws are one thing, common sense is another." I said, "In this case, common sense is following the law." He did not like that. His face tightened, just a little, but enough for me to notice. After that, every conversation with him somehow found its way back to the tree. If I was taking out the trash, he would wander over and say, "Still no plans for that oak, huh?" If Nora was planting herbs, he would shout across the fence, "You know, shade kills more gardens than drought." At the 4th of July cookout, in front of 3 other neighbors, he joked that my tree was holding his yard hostage. People laughed because they thought it was harmless neighbor banter. I smiled too, but inside something had started to shift. There is a difference between being irritated and being watched, and by late summer, I felt watched. I would see Russell standing on his deck with his arms crossed, staring at the oak like it owed him money. One evening, I found a small pile of drooled wood chips near the trunk, and when I asked him about it, he shrugged and said, "Squirrels must be getting ambitious." Nora wanted me to install cameras right then. I should have listened. Instead, I called the county office, asked for a fresh copy of the heritage tree documentation, and put it in a folder by the back door, like paperwork could scare off a man who had already decided rules were only real when they served him. The final warning came on a grey Thursday afternoon. Russell knocked on my door, holding a folded estimate from a tree removal company. He said he had taken the liberty of asking what it might cost, just for information. I did not even invite him inside. I stood there with one hand on the door frame and said, "Russell, listen carefully. That tree is staying. You are not to touch it. Hire anyone to touch it or step onto my property again without permission." He stared at me for a long second, then smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. He said, "You know, Daniel, sometimes people get so attached to things that they stop seeing the bigger picture." I said, "And sometimes people get so entitled they mistake someone else's backyard for a democracy." That was the first time I saw real anger flash across his face. He folded the estimate, tucked it under his arm, and walked away without another word. For 2 weeks after that, nothing happened. No comments, no surprise visits, no passive-aggressive articles under the door. Nora said maybe I had finally gotten through to him. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But silence from a man like Russell was not peace. It was planning. Then came that Saturday morning, still dark enough that the kitchen windows reflected my own face back at me, and that awful mechanical scream tearing through the rain-wet air. I ran outside barefoot at first, then doubled back for boots, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pull them on. The sound stopped just as I reached the porch, and for one strange second, the whole yard went quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the ticking of cooling metal. Then I saw the fence. A clean, rectangular section had been cut out near the back corner, wide enough for a man to walk through carrying equipment. Beyond it, Russell stood in my yard, beside the silver oak chainsaw hanging from one hand, his jacket dusted pale with fresh sawdust. A deep wedge had been carved into the trunk, almost a mouth, and the old tree leaned slightly, wounded but not yet fallen. Russell looked over at me, breathing hard, cheeks red from effort, and said, "Well, do not just stand there, Daniel, once it comes down. You are going to want to get this cleaned up before the rain starts again." For a second, I honestly could not move, and I hate admitting that because everybody likes to imagine themselves as the kind of person who would charge across the yard like some righteous action hero. But the truth is, when you see someone destroying something you love, something old and living and legally protected, your brain does this strange little skip, like it refuses to believe the scene is real. Russell stood there with that chainsaw hanging at his side, casual as a man trimming a hedge, and the silver oak had this terrible open wound carved into it, fresh pale wood exposed beneath the bark, sap already darkening around the cut. I remember saying his name, just one word, Russell, and somehow it came out quieter than I meant it to. He looked at me like I was the one being rude. He said, "Look, I know you are upset right now, but when this is over, you are going to see I did both of us a favor." I walked down the porch steps, and every step felt like I was dropping deeper into some nightmare where basic rules had stopped applying. I said, "You need to put that saw down and get off my property." He rolled his eyes, and said, "Come on, do not start with the property thing again. We have been over this. The tree affects my home too." Behind him, the cut section of fence lay in the wet grass like a piece of evidence. And that was the thing that snapped me out of it. The tree was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, not some guy making a bad judgment call in the heat of the moment. He had planned this. He had walked over with tools, cut through my fence, entered my yard, and started taking down a protected tree because he wanted more sunlight on his roses. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The second he saw the camera, his whole face changed. The smugness did not disappear exactly, but it got nervous around the edges. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Documenting a crime." He barked out a laugh and said, "A crime, Daniel, it is a tree." I kept the camera pointed at him and said, "It is a protected heritage tree on private property behind a fence you cut open. So yeah, Russell, I am pretty comfortable calling it a crime." That was the first time he stopped smiling. He told me to stop being dramatic. Then he started talking faster, saying the tree was a hazard, saying he had noticed rot, saying he was worried it might fall on his house someday. And it was funny in the ugliest way because suddenly he had all these serious concerns he had never mentioned until there was a chainsaw in his hand. I asked him where the arborist report was. He blinked. I said, "You said it was dangerous. So where is the arborist report? Where is the county notice? Where is the emergency order? Where is literally anything showing you had the right to be here?" He gripped the handle of the saw tighter and said, "I do not need a piece of paper to use common sense." From behind me, Nora came out in her robe, hair still wet from the shower, and when she saw the tree, she covered her mouth with both hands. I heard this small sound leave her, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, and that hurt worse than Russell yelling would have. She loved that tree because our daughter had learned to walk under it, because every fall she pressed the prettiest leaves between old cookbooks, because when her father got sick and moved in with us for a while, he used to sit in its shade and feed peanuts to the blue jays. Russell saw none of that. To him, it was shade on his flower bed, and that was all the moral complexity he needed. Nora looked at him and said, "What is wrong with you?" Russell opened his mouth, then shut it, because something about her voice must have landed harder than mine. I called the sheriff first, then the county environmental office, then the number on the heritage canopy paperwork I kept in the folder by the door. By the time the deputy arrived, Russell had set the chainsaw on the ground and was pacing near the fence trying to look inconvenienced instead of guilty. Deputy Harlan was a broad, tired-looking man who had probably spent 20 years listening to neighbors accuse each other of stealing garbage bins and blowing leaves across driveways. But when he saw the cut fence and the tagged oak, his expression changed. He asked Russell if he had permission to be on my property. Russell said, "Not formally." I almost laughed. Not formally, like permission was a dress code. The deputy asked if he had cut the fence. Russell said he had moved an obstruction. The deputy looked down at the rectangular section of fence lying flat in the grass and said, "Sir, that obstruction appears to be Mr. Mercer's fence." Russell started explaining his view again. His roses, the shade, the slope, the potential danger, and the deputy finally held up one hand and said, "I am going to stop you right there, because none of that explains why you entered someone else's fenced yard with a chainsaw." I wish I could say that was the moment Russell realized he was in trouble, but people like him do not process consequences immediately. They process disrespect. He was not scared yet. He was offended. The county arborist arrived about 40 minutes later, a woman named Maribel Chase with a yellow rain jacket, muddy boots, and the calmest face I have ever seen on a person looking at a half-murdered tree. She walked around the oak twice, touched the trunk, inspected the canopy, checked the roots, photographed the heritage tag, then crouched beside the cut and let out this long breath through her nose. I asked if it could be saved. She did not answer right away, and that told me enough. She said the cut is deep, and it compromised the load side of the trunk. With the weather coming in tonight, we cannot leave it standing safely. Nora turned away. I felt like someone had punched me in the ribs. Russell, who had apparently regained a little confidence, jumped in and said, "So I was right. It was dangerous. Maribel looked at him with the kind of patience usually reserved for toddlers in grocery stores and said, "No, sir. It is dangerous now because someone cut into it." That shut him up. The rest of that day is still a blur in my memory. Men in hard hats, ropes thrown over branches, chainsaws that sounded different when professionals used them, careful and sad instead of arrogant. They had to bring the oak down in sections before the storm hit, and I stood on the porch watching pieces of it lowered to the ground like parts of a body. Nora went inside halfway through because she could not watch anymore. Russell stayed near his fence with his arms crossed until Deputy Harlan told him to return to his own property. Even then, he muttered something about everybody overreacting. That night, the rain came hard, pounding the roof until the gutters overflowed, and I lay awake thinking about how empty the backyard looked. It was not just the missing tree. It was the feeling that our home had been entered and altered by someone else's entitlement. People talk about property damage like it is just dollars and receipts, but there is a violation in it, especially when you had warned the person over and over and they heard your no as a temporary obstacle. The next morning, I called an attorney named Elise Porter, who had helped a friend of ours with a land dispute years earlier. I expected a long, cautious conversation, the kind where a lawyer says maybe and possibly and let us see what we can prove. But when I explained the heritage tag, the cut fence, the video, the deputy report, and the arborist's emergency assessment, Elise got very quiet, then said, "Daniel, please do not speak to your neighbor again without me." That sentence was the first warm thing I had felt since the chainsaw started. Over the next week, the situation became bigger than Russell expected, and honestly bigger than I expected too. The county opened a formal violation case because the oak was part of a protected canopy corridor that helped control erosion along 3 adjoining properties. Maribel submitted a report stating the tree had been healthy, structurally sound, and not an immediate threat before Russell cut it. A second independent arborist confirmed it. Elise hired a valuation specialist who handled mature tree loss cases, a man who looked at the stump, measured the trunk diameter, reviewed the species, age, location, ecological role, replacement difficulty, and legal protection status, then gave us a number so large I thought I had misread it. Mature protected trees are not priced like firewood. They are priced like living infrastructure. Russell learned that about 2 weeks later when he received the notice. The next time I saw him, he was standing at the property line holding the envelope, white-faced and furious. He shouted across the yard, $200,000. Are you out of your mind? I was on the porch with a cup of coffee, and for once I did not rush to calm anything down. I said, I did not write the ordinance. He waved the papers like they were burning his hand and said, "You are really going to ruin me over a tree." That got me. I walked down the steps slowly, close enough that he could hear me without either of us shouting, and I said, "No, Russell, you ruined yourself over my tree." There was a long silence after that, the kind that feels almost physical. His wife Candace appeared behind him on their deck, wearing workout clothes and this stunned expression like she had just discovered the man she married was not just difficult, he was expensive. She called his name sharply had he turned on her, saying, "Not now." But she had the papers too, or maybe she had already read them because she said, "Russell, tell me you did not cut their fence." He did not answer. She looked over at me then, and for the first time since they had moved in, I saw embarrassment on that side of the fence. Not apology, not yet, but embarrassment. The hearing was set for late October, and in the weeks leading up to it, Russell tried every version of damage control a guilty man can imagine. First, he sent a typed letter saying he regretted the misunderstanding. Elise told me not to respond. Then he claimed the tree had dropped branches into his yard, so we produced photos from the county inspection showing no major deadwood. Then he claimed he had verbal permission from me, which might have worked if I had not recorded at least 4 conversations over the months where I told him clearly not to touch it. Then, my favorite, he suggested that maybe an unknown vandal had cut the fence and started the job, and he had simply arrived to prevent further harm. Deputy Harlan's body camera footage from that morning did not do him any favors. By the time we walked into the county courthouse, Russell looked smaller somehow, like the weight of his own story had finally begun to press down on him. I sat beside Nora, my folder thick with reports, photos, estimates, and printed copies of the ordinance. Russell sat across the aisle in a navy suit that fit too tightly at the shoulders, with Candace beside him, staring straight ahead. When the judge called the case, Russell still tried to play reasonable. He talked about safety, neighborhood harmony, property value, sunlight, drainage, all dressed up in the language of concern. Then Maribel testified. She was calm, precise, devastating. She explained that the oak had been healthy, that its roots stabilized the slope. The removal without authorization created erosion concerns, and that Russell's cut forced the emergency takedown. The judge listened without much expression, but I noticed the way his pen stopped moving when Maribel said the tree had likely stood for more than 90 years. Then Alice played my phone video. There was Russell, sawdust on his jeans, standing in the wound he had made, telling me I would want to get it cleaned up before the rain. In the courtroom, the sound felt worse than it had in real life. Russell stared at the table. Candace closed her eyes, and I sat there with my hands folded so tightly my knuckles hurt, realizing that justice does not always feel like victory when it is happening. Sometimes it just feels like finally being believed. When Elise finished playing the video, the courtroom stayed quiet for a few seconds longer than it needed to, and that silence did more damage to Russell than any argument could have. You could hear somebody shifting in the back row, the faint hum of the lights, the judge tapping his pen once against the folder in front of him. Russell's attorney stood up and tried to soften it, saying emotions were high, saying his client had acted out of genuine concern, saying nobody could deny that large trees sometimes became hazards in mountain communities like ours. And honestly, he was not wrong in the broadest possible sense. Trees do fall, storms do happen, people do get hurt. But that was the trick Russell had been trying to pull from the beginning, take a general truth and wrap it around one very specific lie. The judge asked him one simple question. Mr. Vance, before the morning in question, did any certified arborist tell you this tree was unsafe? Russell swallowed hard and said, not in those exact words. The judge leaned back and said, in any words. Russell looked down at the table. No, Your Honor. There it was. Russell looked down at the table. No, Your Honor. There it was. All the speeches about safety, all the concern for the neighborhood, all the big picture nonsense, and in the end it came down to one man who wanted sun on his roses and decided my no was less important than his want. The judge went through the findings slowly. The oak had been protected. It had been healthy. It stood on my property. Russell had entered through a fence he intentionally cut. His actions forced the emergency removal of a heritage canopy tree, and under the county ordinance, damages were calculated at triple the appraised replacement and ecological value. When the judge said the total out loud, just over $200,000 in combined penalties and restitution, Russell made this sound like someone had stepped on his throat. Candace put one hand over her mouth. Nora reached under the table and squeezed my knee, not in celebration exactly, more like she was keeping me anchored to the chair. Part of the money would go to the county restoration fund, part would be directed toward planting and maintaining a replacement tree on our property, and a smaller portion would come to us for site repair and monitoring costs. The judge was very clear that I was not walking out of there with some cartoon sack of cash. This was not a lottery ticket. This was a consequence. Russell was also ordered to repair the fence within 90 days, using a licensed contractor, with inspection afterward. On the trespassing charge, he received a formal warning, which annoyed me at first. I will not lie, because after everything he had done, a warning felt like a wet paper towel slapped onto a house fire. But Elise leaned toward me and whispered, "Let the judgment be enough." And looking at Russell's face, I realized maybe it was. He was pale, smaller than he had looked even that morning, and for the first time since I had known him, he did not seem angry that people were disagreeing with him. He seemed afraid that the world had finally answered back. Outside the courthouse, he tried one last time. He waited near the steps while Nora and I walked out with Elise, and his voice had lost that polished, neighborly tone. He said, "Daniel, we can work something out." I stopped, but Elise touched my arm. A reminder not to engage. Russell kept going anyway. He said, "You know this will destroy us. You know I will have to refinance the house." Candace stood a few feet behind him, arms folded, staring at the parking lot like she wanted to disappear into the asphalt. I looked at Russell, and I did feel something then. Not pity exactly, but the heavy ugliness of watching someone meet the bill for who they had chosen to be. I said, "I told you not to touch it. That was all. No speech, no victory lap, no clever line for the cameras that were not there." Just the sentence he had ignored until it became expensive. Winter came early that year. The backyard looked naked without the oak, and for a while I hated going out there. The stump was ground down. The soil was rebuilt, erosion barriers went in, and county workers came by with orange flags and measuring tape, planning the replacement. Russell's fence repair crew showed up in November, and I watched from the kitchen windows they rebuilt the section he had cut, board by board, like a scar being stitched closed. It did not come outside that day. Candace did. She stood with the contractor, signed the inspection form, then glanced toward our house. Nora was beside me washing a mug in the sink, and when Candace gave this small, embarrassed nod, Nora nodded back. That was as close as we ever got to an apology from that household. By spring, the county planted the young bur oak near the original spot, not as grand, not even close, but strong, straight, and stubborn-looking. Maribel told us it would outlive all of us if nobody with a chainsaw and a personality disorder got any ideas. Nora laughed for the first time about the whole thing, a real laugh, and I remember feeling the knot in my chest loosen just a little. The funniest part, if you can call it funny, was where they planted it. Because of the slope, the root zone, and the canopy corridor requirements, the new tree had to go close to where the old one had stood, which meant as it grew, it would eventually cast shade over the same corner of Russell's yard. Not that year, not for many years, but someday. There was something almost poetic about that. He had destroyed a 90-year-old tree because he could not tolerate shade, and the law answered by planting him a future. We installed cameras after that, small ones tucked under the eaves, nothing dramatic, just enough to make sure our backyard never felt unwatched again. Sometimes people ask me if the punishment was too harsh, and I understand the question. $200,000 is life-changing money. It can break a family budget, strain a marriage, turn dinner conversations into whispered arguments behind closed doors. I heard later from another neighbor that Russell and Candace took out a second mortgage, and I would be lying if I said that did not sit strangely with me. I did not wake up hoping to become the reason someone refinanced their house. I wanted my tree back. That was the one thing no court could give me. But then I think about that Saturday morning, the fence cut open, the sawdust on his jeans, the way he told me to clean it up before the rain, and I remind myself that consequences only look cruel when we ignore every warning that came before them. Russell still lives next door. We do not wave anymore. His roses died the following summer, by the way, not because of shade, but because he overwatered them during a humid spell and the roots rotted. I wish I could say I took the high road and felt nothing when I found out, but I stood at my kitchen sink, looked out at that little new bur oak catching the morning light, and smiled into my coffee like the petty man I apparently am. So now I want to know what you think. Was the court right to make Russell pay that much for one protected tree, or did the punishment go too far once it threatened his home and his marriage? Would you have pushed for every dollar, or would you have settled just to keep peace in the neighborhood? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I know people are going to be split on this one, and if you have ever dealt with a neighbor who thought your property was their personal project, tell us how it ended. And if you want more true stories about entitled people learning that boundaries are not suggestions, hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because trust me, some people do not learn until the bill shows up.